Hello! Yan, live tayo ngayon Kamusta kayo dyan? Naabutan natin finally yung Eat Bulaga Hours. Okay, so today pag-usapan natin yung nangyari over the weekend. No? Some very important development dito sa ating bansa. No? So I think as many people predicted, there will be some sort of a united administration, no? Pagdating sa 2022 elections. No? So yung opposition, mukhang hindi sila naging successful doon sa building of a united team, no, or unity team. Medyo expected yet in a certain way. Pero yung administration side, which actually had at least two top contenders, no, potentially in this election. So one was of course from the House of Duterte, Sara Duterte, consistently topping surveys between fourth quarter of last year and the second quarter of this year. And then of course you also have the scion of the former Philippine strongman, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., who also consistently was somewhere in number 2, no? Dun sa mga surveys. But nakita natin sa third quarter of this year, Bongbong Marcos began to experience some surge, while yung Dutertes are hindi sila masyadong clear, no, dun sa kanilang plano, no? And I think this wishy-washy position on the part of Duterte is actually handed at least for the presidential run, yung momentum sa House of Marcos. No? So dito nakikita natin na Bongbong Marcos Jr. has been quite successfully positioning himself as the candidate of continuity at saka yung essentially presidential candidate ng Duterte administration. Former Senator Marcos made it very clear earlier in October na ally siya ni Pangulong Duterte. No? So he really called upon the incumbent president, to support his bid for the presidency. At sabi niya nga, kailangan i-maximize ito yung mga alliances because this is the way forward. So here we are. So mukhang hindi na tutuloy yung expected showdown between Sara Duterte and Bongbong Marcos. In fact, as I've been saying for months now, pwede nyo titignan yung mga ibang sinulat natin, yung mga ibang videos natin, Bongbong Marcos has been steadily building up the momentum. And I think Bongbong Marcos did not want to enter this race kung mag-head-to-head na showdown sila ni Sara Duterte. That would make it very difficult. Bongbong Marcos is still smarting dun sa kanilang defeat in 2016 elections. Of course, hindi nila tanggap. Razor thin yung margins, although lumaki pa yung lead ni Lenny Robredo after the recounts done by the Supreme Court. Malaki yung medyo ginastos nila Bongbong Marcos dyan. But I mean, for Bongbong Marcos, in this race, medyo mas sigurista na sila even compared dun sa 2016 elections. Remember, Bongbong Marcos was beginning to take the lead towards the end of the race, and then Lenny Robredo medyo humabol sa kanya. So I don't think the Marcoses are interested to join this race unless talagang sigurado sila that they will be very, very competitive in this race. No? So kitang-kita natin dito na as soon as the camp of former Senator Marcos sensed that they could be the candidate of the administration, the candidate of continuity, I would even say candidate of restoration, kasi hindi lang mga Duterte ang pinag-usapan dito, but the Marcos ideal, the Marcos regime, in many ways ang pinag-usapan dito, no? Bringing back the Marcos brand, no, ang pinag-usapan dito. So I think as soon as they sense na hindi masyadong sure si Sara Duterte, they seize the momentum. So sabi ko nga whatever yung mga substitution na mga maneuver dyan, if Sara Duterte wants to pull off a maneuver and run for the president, I'm not sure it will work. No? Walang element of surprise, walang rallying effect, and most importantly, Marcos was already doing his assignment. No? He was positioning to be yung candidate ng administration. And pag titignan natin yung mga iba't ibang surveys, may mga kunyaring surveys, may mga medyo credible surveys, clearly the momentum is on the part of Bongbong Marcos. Now, nakita natin some of the surveys suggesting that if Sara Duterte doesn't run, Bongbong Marcos can easily be in the 30% to 40% territory. No? So that will put him in a very commanding position. Nakikita din natin sa mga surveys, again, we have to wait for some of the more credible surveys in the coming weeks, and hopefully November we'll have some of these numbers. But some of the trend lines that we're seeing it is that Bongbong Marcos is consolidating yung vote of the right. Yung 16 million ni Pangulong Duterte ay nagko-consolidate behind Bongbong Marcos. A lot of allies of the Dutertes, LGU levels, are consolidating behind Marcos. Here, at the same time, nakita natin that Lenny Robredo is also rising in the ranks. At least base dun sa mga ibang surveys na nakita natin na almost all of the surveys recently, again, there are questions about their credibility. We can go one by one, but all of them show that, yes, Bongbong Marcos is becoming the top candidate to beat in these elections. I've been saying this for quite some time, but Lenny Robredo has also been rising in the ranks. So quite similar dun sa 2016 elections. Nakita natin na just as Bongbong Marcos rises, Leni Robredo also rises. Of course, may lead. Medyo malaki ang lead ni Bongbong Marcos sa mga surveys, kay Leni Robredo, among other things. But interestingly, it seems that similar dynamic, this kind of a symbiotic increase in the numbers of both sides is happening. So it seems it serves also Leni Robredo's camp to kind of position themselves in juxtaposition to Bongbong Marcos. So yun yung strategy nila. At nakita natin yun, yung ginawa nilang strategy kay ISKO Moreno. No? They wanted to make this race about preventing another Marcos from capturing the Malacanang. So I think that's where ang ginawa nila was try to question whether ISKO Moreno is gonna fight that fight. And obviously ISKO Moreno was not interested in that fight. Primarily was interested in a much more centrist fight. And so ang strategy ng mga some people, at least in the camp of Leni Robredo, is to make this a fight between themselves and the Marcoses, and that's where I think Leni Robredo's strategy has been. It worked kind of in 2016 elections. It might work again this time, at least based on some of the preliminary surveys that we're seeing. We can discuss the ISKO Moreno strategy later on, problems with their communications, and some of the changes or adjustments they have to make. Recent surveys are not showing any significant increase in numbers for ISKO, but let's see. I'll wait for the next Pulse Asia surveys, and hopefully SWS will begin to also release surveys, because in absence of that, we're essentially left with Pulse Asia as the authoritative survey. So you want to have at least several options that will always be good for us to have certain kinds of comparisons. Mamaya na tayo reaction dyan. Yan, shout out tayo dyan mamaya. Okay, now, let me go to these important issues. Yung mga dyan, pasaway dyan. We have no tolerance, no? Kung ad hominem kayo dyan, tanggal kayo dito. Okay, you're not welcome here. Okay, let's be very clear about this. Troll kayo ng troll past few days since yung survey natin. I've been so kind, but this is our rules, okay? We're not gonna tolerate yung mga pasaway dyan na nag-google lang. Okay, anyways, let's go back to the discussion. Actually, this will be the subject of my column tomorrow for Philippine Daily Inquirer. Again, I've been writing all over the world, but dun sa Philippine Daily Inquirer, kasi dun sa column ko, I have more freedom, and not freedom, parang I'm more playful or more explorative in terms of my analysis. Kasi medyo tight dapat yung analysis mo in specific areas, but medyo international publications. Sometimes at yung gusto ng mga editors, yung etc. But dito sa Philippine Daily Inquirer, my topic, my rules, my approach, no? So here I'm a little bit more explorative, bring in more political philosophy and discussions like that. So you'll see a little bit of Sigmund Freud, you'll see potentially Hobsbawm, you'll see a lot of Max Weber. Max Weber is someone I really look up to. And this is going to be the basis of my analysis of why Marcoses are so strong nowadays. No? Now, towards the end of First World War, Max Weber, one of the greatest thinkers of all time, a German sociologist, he gave two important lectures in Munich. Sorry for the German, Munich. In Munich, he gave two series of lectures. One on the vocation of the scholar, one on the vocation of the statesman or a politician, right? That's very important sets of lectures na it has been read over and over again by activists and statesmen over time. And I really suggest folks to pay attention to that. Now, this is important because as Freud said, scholars or education and statesmen or government, these are the two so-called impossible professions. Napakahirap yung dalawang professions na yan. And I'll show you shortly why mahalaga ito dito sa discussion natin when it comes to the Marcoses. Now, shortly when it comes to the academics, Max Weber, ang discussion is he's concerned with academic institutions including universities that hindi sapat yung bayad. Maraming mga young scholars and teachers have been living semi-proletariat working conditions. I'm actually directly quoting what he said. And then, of course, a lot of mediocrities, especially in the higher positions in the universities. And all, kasi alam natin, a lot of times people rise through the ranks, including in university, because of how they navigate medieval politics, not necessarily about the merit of their work or their Google Scholar citation or H-index, or the level of how prolific they are in terms of contributing to not only scholarly discussions but public intellectual discussion. No? So his problem was that in the educational institutions, increasingly may ossification ang nangyari. No? Mediocre people are rising through the ranks, opportunistic academics are rising through the ranks, yung mga magagaling ay ostracized, marginalized, pushed away. Younger academics and scholars live impossible working conditions. A lot of teachers are underpaid. Now, you can see the relevance of that to our case in the Philippines. Now, of course, he was talking about Germany 100 years ago. We're talking about 1919. No? This is towards the end of the First World War. Within few years, there'll be the Weimar Republic, and the Weimar Republic very much looks like our post-Marcos regime, right? That's a regime, well-intentioned but feeble. And eventually, we saw how the Weimar Republic actually collapsed, and we know what it was replaced by in the 1930s. Now, of course, ang mahirap din kasi sa buhay ng mga scholars is that para sa'yo, napaka-importanteng issue yan, but there's no guarantee of success. No? Success is not guaranteed, to use a quotation by Max Weber. No? So, mahirap talagang buhay ng mga scholars kasi you don't know if people are even gonna bother to read your works. I mean, look at it this way. May mga pinapost ako dito na pang troll lang. You get, 300,000 responses, 500,000 responses. Then, you work 6 months to 1 year on a journal article, and how many people read it? 20 people? 200 people? Kasama ba dyan yung reviewers? So really, real scholarship is a very difficult job, not to mention in a lot of countries, including the Philippines, it's an underappreciated, underpaid in many ways profession, among other things. No, but let's go to the second one, which is a very interesting issue. Yung analysis ni Weber, similar to Freud, on the role of politicians. Now, this is the problem. In today's world, in today's information ecosystem, para maging successful kang statesman, first of all, dapat makilala ka ng tao. First of all, as Max Weber put it, you have to leave an impression, right, on the world. Kasi never man gaano ka kagaling magsalita, napakaganda yung conviction mo sa buhay, napakaganda yung CV mo. Kung hindi ka magaling mag-self-promote, or hindi ka nakilala ng tao dahil hindi ka marunong paano mag-navigate ng mainstream media or social media or TikTok among others. Remember, Max Weber is talking 100 years ago, but he already anticipated how things are going to turn out, right? So, he'll absolutely not be surprised by what's happening nowadays. So, kung hindi ka makilala, even though napakagaling mo, napakagaling CV mo, etc., wala kang chance to be a politician because we're talking about mass politics nowadays. It's about numbers. It's not about 10,000 people, 100,000 people. It's about 10 million people, 20 million people, 100 million people, or more in case of places like Indonesia, or especially in the case like India, no? Yung grabe yung number of voters. So, when you're talking about retail politics and mass politics, ang napakamahalaga dito is, first of all, you have to first be known. People have to know that you exist to begin with. At people have to find you charismatic on TV, radio, among others. Kasi ang malaking chance dyan is very few will be able to see you in person, right? Of course, during campaign, you'll try to visit all the provinces and areas as much as possible. Pero limitado yung magiging interaction directly ng tao with you. Unless, of course, may FB Alive ka, ating FB Alive mo is seen as a kind of a spontaneous, simultaneous interaction. No? So wala tayong notes, I'm just speaking from my heart, from my mind rather, so you could see saan galing yung mga ideas na yan. No? So wala tayong notes, hindi ito scripted, this is perfectly just out of our mind. So, going back to that, ito yung sinasabi ni Max Weber. The problem is that while you need to make impression on the world, meaning makilala ka, magaling ka mag-navigate ng media landscape, among others, at the same time, you have to make sure that hindi mo makalimutan yung mga goals mo bilang politiko. You're joining politics, if you're a real statesman, to really help the society, to really uplift yung level of living conditions of the people, to really contribute something to the improvement of the body politic, to the maturity and functioning of your democracy and state institutions. No? But the problem is that because napakalaki yung pressure on politicians to be constantly known and recognized, what happens is that they could fall for vanity, or they could fall for performative politics. At napakamahalaga yan, no? Sa mga Dolomite-style politics, no? Yung purong performative, wala naman masyadong substance. And of course, the fear that Max Weber had is, in an era of celebrity politics, right? Vanity will be a big problem. And for him, he used the terms, very strong terms for that. Something like vanity is like the kind of like a scourge or death knell for people who really want to fulfill their duties. No? So this is a very big dilemma for modern politicians. Kasi kung mabait ka, magaling ka among others, tapos ayaw mo mag-engage sa media antics and circus and all, baka hindi ka makilala to ng people. People will not appreciate you. Remember, a lot of people have impressions of a leader Not really because they know that person intimately or dahil nag-research talaga sila ng background or tinignan talaga yung CV or tinignan talaga yung assessment or indices of his or her performance dun sa LGU niya dati. No. It's really about strong siya eh. Ang ganda ng lakas ng dating eh. Mabait siyang tignan eh. So it's all about impressions are very, very important. There's a performativity to modern politics. And this is the concern. So kung magaling ka talagang politiko, and this is where I actually try to transcend even Max Weber, you have to combine two elements to be a great statesman. And these two elements, I'm going to use the terms of Max Weber, the ethics of personal conviction and the ethics of responsibility. So the ethics of personal conviction is that huwag mong kalimutan yung mga values that you stand for. Politics is not an easy task. Teaching also is a vocation like politics. It's not an easy task. You cannot just treat it as a career. Hindi lang business or politics or family business, right? You cannot treat it that way. You have to treat it as vocation, as a calling, no? But of course, at the same time, you have to have ethics of responsibility. What does it mean? Ibig sabihin, dapat hindi yung parang pamoral-moral ka lang, no? You know, as much as dapat decente ka, dapat effective ka rin leader. And to be an effective leader, you have to also realize the realities on the ground, build coalitions, realize that hindi lang ikaw tama siguro at hindi lahat mag-agree sa'yo. So you have to cross the aisle sometimes, build alliances across the fence. So sometimes you have to make some tough choices, difficult choices that parang nung una hindi mo masikmura kung gusto mo magpa-pure effect lang. So you have to combine these two elements. And that's where I kind of disagree with Max Weber na these two are separate. I think the two can be combined. And good leaders are precisely people who know their basic principles, may red line sila sa buhay, hindi sila kurakot, mandanakaw, mamamatay tao. At the same time, they know how to build alliances across the aisle, across the political spectrum, across the fence. No? So yun yung important factors na dapat natin pag-usapan pagdating sa politicians. But yun nga a lot of people do not pull that off. A lot of people would just fall for performative politics at tinatratong yung politika bilang career or family business. This is the threat that Max Weber was already seeing more than 100 years ago. And a lot of academics and scholars also. This is the problem. They're treating their profession, their vocation actually, in many ways, as just another career. No? So marami dyan, kilala natin, no? Sinisite ng sarili parate, you know, they're looking for ways for their friends to cite them. Ang tawag, my term dyan is Soviet, Soviet citation people. Yung mga tipong, they know how to game the system in order to get the points in order to rise through the ranks, among other things. And now, let's go to the meat of the analysis. Bakit ito relevant sa Pilipinas? So ito, after na overthrow yung Marcos regime in 1986, there was a unique opportunity for the new leadership of the country to push for some radical transformational reforms, right? Not a la Bolshevik Russia, you know, not a la Chinese Revolution, no. But at least, no, from the time na umalis sila Marcos at pumunta sila Hawaii until the promulgation of the 1987 Constitution, there was an absolute revolutionary moment whereby the leaders of EDSA movement had a rare opportunity to really place the foundations for some fundamental reforms. Yung land reform, ang dami mga oligarchs na hawak dyan. Yung holding corrupt cronies accountable. Making sure hindi mag-proliferate yung political dynasties. Making sure may totoo tayong political parties. Making sure we don't pay odious debt and only pay legitimate debt. Hindi yung mga debt na kinuha lang ng mga cronies na Marcoses at hindi na natin alam saan pumunta or alam natin saan pumunta actually sa Swiss or Swiss bank accounts among others. There was really an absolute opportunity to also come up with the right trade and industrial policy para siguraduhin yung Pilipinas will finally build the kind of industrial foundation for long-term economic development. And then tignan mo yung product na lumabas, 1987 Constitution. Okay, I love the Constitution because it upholds basic civil rights, democracy. Sure, I mean, that's why meron tayong FBI Live dito, no? And we can have this kind of free discussions. I'm really happy about that. But I have a number of problems with that Constitution. First of all, it's extremely verbose, if not badly written. I think kung dumaan itong Constitution natin in terms of just editing of the prose, mga 6 drafts siguro ang dapat dumaan ito. The prose is not good. The prose is so lawyerish. Just look at the American Constitution or Constitution of a lot of mature democracies around the world. An average citizen has to be able to properly read and understand the Constitution. Kung yung Constitution, may saligang batas, may napaka-verbose, badly written, at daming jargons, how is that supposed to be a democratic constitution when vast majority of the population cannot even go through a paragraph without like what on earth is this, right? It shouldn't be a constitution that only lawyers or some journalists can understand or professors. It should be a constitution that everyone can understand. Number two, dito sa bagong saligang batas, yan ang hindi ko maintindihan. Obviously, ang dami natin mga political dynasties and all. Malaking problema yan before martial law. And during martial law, of course, the biggest political dynasty took over Malacanang, right? Or the one that took over Malacanang created the biggest political dynasties, right? And now, of course, they're back in force. But let's go back to that. Walang automatic na batas laban sa political dynasties doon sa ating saligang batas ng 1997 Constitution. So, iniwan yung prerogative to come up with enabling laws against political dynasties sa isang kongreso na dominate ng political dynasties. Parang weird, di ba? Parang iniwan mo yung refereeing dun sa kalaban mo, di ba? This doesn't make sense. I mean, there should have been an automatic enabling law doon mismo embedded in the 1987 Constitution para hindi puro mga political dynasty lang dominate ng post-Marcosian democratic regime, right? So that's one thing I cannot really understand. At the same time, of course, you have to have real political parties, and for that you have to have certain key provisions. Kasama dyan yung anti-defections law. So if you go to some of the mature democracies, kung balimbing ka lang, papalit-palit ng partido, you will be punished for that. You will be punished for that. You know, you can be even suspended, right, from the parliament, among other things. Again, we don't see any of these things in our dun sa ating saligang batas. The list is long. I mean, I also have problems with just a single 6-year term in office. It's too long for a bad president. It's too short for a good president. Mas maganda yung 2 terms in office. May option for re-election. There's a pressure to perform well in the first term para ma-re-elect ka again. We had that before, no? Before martial law, we had 2-4 years. Or we can have the Indonesian system 2-5 years. Kung magaling ka, okay. Kung hindi ka magaling, hindi ka ma-re-elect. As simple as that. So there's a pressure on you to perform and to get re-elected, no? And to have a legacy term, to have a kind of a performance term at the same time, right? So I can go on and on. And this is the really frustration I have. Kung talagang pag-aralan mo na itong saligang batas natin, it might sound nice to some lawyers and activists and all of that, but honestly, from a social science, public administration, governance standpoint, from a comparative politics standpoint, by that time, ang dami natin pwedeng tignan around the world, yung mga modifications, whether it's South Africa, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in US. Kaya nga ang daming amendments yung US Constitution. So over time, they try to improve it, tweak it, to make sure na ito ay tugma doon sa mga needs of the time. So medyo yun ang concern ko dito sa ating saligang batas. Parang hilaw ang daming loopholes, no? On the second level, right, the other problem we also have had in the past 2 or 3 decades, at least, is yung judicial institutions natin, yung penal institutions natin. Ang laki ng problema pagdating sa issue ng hustisya at demokrasya sa ating bansa. Very few, if any, high-level politician has been held accountable for any kind of major crime or abuse of power over the past 3 or 4 decades. And this is really an anomaly, right? This is a big anomaly. Kitang-kita natin yung numbers of pre-trial detainees, can you imagine, majority of people inside the jail system are pre-trial detainees, hindi sila convicted. A senator of this republic, Leila de Lima, has not been convicted of any crime. You know, kamusta yung trial process niya, diba? And yet, you know, incarcerated siya. I mean, kaya nga people will fall for people like Duterte who say like, you know, essentially let's go for vigilante justice, right? Because the existing judicial institutions have not been working. Look at the efficacy of our top courts, efficacy of mga institutions na in charge, you know, Ombudsman Office for instance, in charge of making sure transparent yung mga politiko, yung sal nila, among other things. Kamusta yung performance? Of course, we have had good ombudswomen or men over time. Conchita Carpio Morales, a great ombudswoman, among other things. But some would say they're more the exception to the rule, unfortunately, right? And so, marami sa ating mga institutions in charge of ensuring accountability and all, hindi sila empowered. So you have generalized impunity in this country. So you have systematic lack of accountability. At look at the Marcoses, pinabalik sila noong 1991 onwards as if wala. And of course, they had all the resources and everything like that, at consolidate sila ng position in Northern Philippines, and slowly they worked their way back. No, actually, systematically and slowly, they worked their way back. And, you know, di ba, si Imelda was already convicted a few years ago, right? By Supreme Court pa yata yung level na yan, di ba? But what happened? But what happened, right? So this is the problem. So people become cynical. People lose faith in democracy and human rights and state institutions when they see this kind of generalized impunity. So, kaya madali sabihin na bakit Marcoses lang titignan natin, tignan mo si ganito, si ganyan, si ganyan. Because there's so many corrupt politicians all around, and so much corruption happening, and not much of accountability. Yes, may mga Blue Ribbon Commission talk, may mga ingay-ingay dyan, medyo sa media, sa Senate, etc. Tingnan natin anong gagawin ni Tulfo in the future. But ano yung follow-through? Ano yung follow-through in terms of really holding people accountable who have been abusing power, who have been stealing taxpayers' money, and other things. So, you see, this generalized climate of impunity has really made a lot of people cynical, or at least very skeptical of democratic, reformist kinds of politicians. Ay, wala naman mangyari dyan. So, which brings us also to the third level of failure of governance. Just look at the proliferation of fake news and trolls and among other things. Again, we're not saying that supporters of all candidates are fake. Obviously not, right? Marcos have many genuine supporters. At the same time, we all know for a fact that there are so many reports, Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, our good friend Jonathan Ong, based in Harvard and University of Massachusetts. A lot of these people have done research on troll farms. This is a reality. We are a global hub for troll farms, right? And there's no any legal regulatory move to make sure that there's no abuse of our basic freedoms and freedoms on social media, and of course Facebook, among others, mas busy dito sa kanilang concerns about profit making, and you know, this is attention economy to them. Business lang sa kanila yan, diba? So just look at how, I mean, 130,000 lang yata yung followers ko dito, tapos yung mga nag-react one. Okay, but anyways, so on so many levels, we have failures of failures of governance, and the weakness of these institutions is because after all the shenanigans of the 70s and 80s, walang concerted effort by post-Marcosian leaders to actually rehabilitate and strengthen these institutions. Yes, there were efforts here and there under several reformist administrations, but kapos hindi siya sustained. Hindi siya sustained. And sometimes there will be good reforms here, and then may corruption there, so parang hypocrisy ang lumalabas, diba? And sometimes when you expose corruption, as what happened under Aquino administration, you know, the whole, you know, alam na natin yan, diba, yung mga corruption scandals, yung mga pork barrel and all of that. What it did was actually to make people more cynical. Grabe palang corruption, wala naman palang, lahat pala corrupt di ba tayo mag-focus lang kay Hera? Bakit tayo mag-focus lang kay Marcos, or for supporters of Binay, bakit Binay lang mga ina-attack mo, tignan mo ganun. So you see, this is the problem. So this generalized skepticism that was created. So we have three levels of failure as far as post-Marcosian statesmanship and governance is concerned. Now let's go to the education part. This is the second, you know, impossible profession identified by Freud, and also Max Weber had a discussion on that. Now, balikan natin yung issue ng edukasyon. Pag titignan mo yung ating basic education, really, if you go yung dun sa ating kasaysayan, sa junior high school, etc., base dun sa naalala ko is, walang masyadong discussions about martial law. Walang exhaustive discussions about martial law, its impact on our economy, the human rights issues. I won't use the word whitewash entirely, but graywash, you could say. I mean, so there's no commensurability between dun sa ating saligang batas, which is supposed to be very anti-Marcosian, and then yung basic education natin, which is like, it's just like just any ordinary day in Philippine history, right? So this is the problem. And remember, ang obligasyon ng mga educators is not to spoon-feed us information. You can just Google that on your own. It's to create a culture of critical thinking. It's to instill in us the ability to properly assess evidence against evidence and separate fake news from debatable news to opinionated news to factual news, right? So, yung critical thinking skills ang medyo kulang talaga dun sa training natin pagdating sa basic education. Now, of course, coming from University of Philippines, Diliman, I got a certain kind of training. But, you know, I've taught in Ateneo, I've taught in LaSalle, I've taught in, you know, different university across in the country, at least in Metro Manila and abroad. And I noticed that, we really have great teachers and students in all universities across the country. This is not just a UP thing. But we really need to make sure from in basic education pa lang instill natin itong critical thinking, no? Because napakamahalaga ito. And let me go to the second level of analysis pagdating sa issue ng education. The second problem we have in education is this. We have many mercenary influencers and some self-aggrandizing academics, right? We're not gonna name names, that seem to be too tempted by the cottage industry of historical revisionism. May mga nakikita tayo dyan na, yung ganito yung dissertation ko, ganito yung mga, we have to have an objective analysis of what happened in the past. As if non-existent itong tons of peer-reviewed studies published by the top publications. And a lot of times these people are raising questions about this. They're not even, forget about tier 1, they're not even tier C academics. Just look at their Google Scholar, just look at their publication track record, etc. So ginagamit yung mga credentials nila, but their publication credential is like, right? And a lot of these people, they cannot ignore it kasi very lucrative itong cottage industry ng historical revisionism, right? And we know exactly, you know exactly what we're talking about here. So you have these people kind of using their credentials or half-real credentials to kind of create a kind of academic skepticism about very well documented, peer-reviewed study published in the best publications in the world, Chicago University Press. I can go on and on and on, and some of the sources we have cited ourselves, right? So for some of these people who are not really well published or not published in any publication of note, at least in recent years, wala silang serious contribution to historical analysis of back in the days, martial lawyers among others, So this is sad because you would expect that, top professors or at least senior professors, some of these people, who have the training, at least to a certain degree, have certain following among others, use it not for indulging in self-serving, self-aggrandizing historical revisionism, but to actually instill critical thinking. Now, those are the two things I discussed. So yung mga kakulangan sa ating governance at saka yung kakulangan natin dito sa education systems natin. And these two factors I think have been very important in laying the foundations for really an authoritarian nostalgia and for the Marcoses to really become a major force in our politics, so much so that I wouldn't be surprised if Bongbong Marcos may end up getting 30-40% of the votes. That may not be a majority, but that's a big statement in itself, and that's absolutely enough for him to become the next president because we only have a single round first past the post system. Now, let's go to the third level of analysis, right? Which is where we want to be fair. Let me put it this way. Alam niyo naman yung stance ko about authoritarian leaders, authoritarian populists, among others. Actually, I'm very nuanced. I'm very, very nuanced. I interviewed Prime Minister Mahathir 2 years ago when he visited Manila, and I told him, nung bata ko, you were like the dictator of Malaysia, and he kind of laughed them all. But now, of course, you have been, acting or singing or dancing to a different tune, no? Lee Kuan Yew is someone I've been really studying over time. Singapore is one of my favorite places. I have very good friends and colleagues there. I almost ended up teaching actually in Singapore a few years ago, but it's a long story. Who knows? Maybe I'll go back there again. But let's not go there. We can discuss that later on. So I'm not unfair. I mean, I've really studied a lot of authoritarian leaders throughout time. I mean, one of my favorite leaders of all time is actually Peter the Great of Russia, and obviously he was no liberal democrat, and I don't think such thing even existed back in the days. So we have had cases of developmental dictatorships, right? Park Chung-hee, Korea. I would say Peter the Great in case of Russia. You could talk about the Kuomintang and the heirs of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. We can go on and on. And not to mention, of course, I mean, Singapore is a city-state. Medyo hindi siya comparable sa South Korea and other countries. But even Lee Kuan Yew, did a lot of great things for his country, which absolutely is beyond doubt. So, hindi tayo hater. I mean, there are competent authoritarian leaders who actually paved the way for a much more democratic and progressive country. South Korea is case in point. In fact, my favorite country, right? When it comes to transition from developmental authoritarianism all the way to really mature, cutting-edge democracy and economy, no? So, we try to be as fair as much possible dito sa varieties of authoritarianism. And this is where, of course, I raise concerns about the Marcos era. Saan yung mga chaebols niya? Under Park Chung-hee, you know, the Samsungs and LGs and all of that became global companies. Hyundai became global companies under Park Chung-hee. Ano ba yung pangtapat ni Marcos doon? Right? I mean, of course, you can go on and blame Ramos and Corin, but you had 21 years in power, right? 21 years in power is a long, long time. You can do a lot in 21 years. So look at Park Chung-hee. Look at the Kuomintang Party in Taiwan. Within 20 years, what he achieved. Look at Mahathir in his first 20 years in power, what he achieved in Malaysia. You know, the Petronas Towers and beautiful airport and Proton cars and a lot of that. You know, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, anong mapakita ni Marcos yan? But, there's no but the thing is this, pag napanood niyo yung Project Pilipinas episode namin with Dr. Lisandro Claudio from University of California, Berkeley, my former colleague sa Ateneo Political Science Department, we had a very interesting discussion on this because, so dun sa first two, di ba, na-discuss ko yung mga kakulangan, if not failures, of our statesmen and educators in the post-Marcosian era, no? But, at the same time, I think what makes Ferdy Marcos or McCoy really attractive to a lot of Filipinos is that one thing you can tell about those guys, actually two things I can tell about that guy, is this. First of all, audacity to have vision. Ferdinand Marcos had really a vision for the country. I may not agree with his execution. I may have some problems with his export-oriented industrialization strategy. I have some concerns about his reliance on cronies, right? One of them, of course, a big element in Hacienda Luisita. So, you know, we can discuss that. But one thing you can tell about Marcos is that, especially dun sa speech niya, and I've talked to people who talked to Marcos back in the days, he had a vision for the country. There was an ambition for greatness. And yun yung medyo nawala over the years after Marcos. If you look at a lot of our leaders, there's a certain degree of mediocrity in terms of their vision for the country. Wala silang really long-term 5, 10, 15, 20 years vision for the country. At yun yung medyo kapos tayo, no? So, I really hope we have leaders who have true vision for the country, industrial policy, trade policy, yung position natin sa mundo, yung position natin sa ASEAN at least. So yun, yung audacity to have a great vision, I think is important. And also have, of course, some idea, some competence to discuss industrial policy, trade policy, foreign policy. And actually the second level, where I think Marcos really did something interesting, and I would say some of the better points of what happened in the past. Because let's be honest, it's unfair to say everything was just bad during those years, and to say everything is good during these years, of course, it's inaccurate. It's very inaccurate, right? The thing that also went kind of okay back in those days is yung foreign policy natin. So kung titignan mo yung era niya, first of all, I don't buy this argument na Marcos was tuta ng America. In fact, Marcos was quite competent in playing this kind of a multifarious, omni-balancing strategy, in terms of international relations. So he had, communication channels with the Soviet Union, via, yung ex-communists in the Philippines. Based on some of the studies we see, he opened up also communication channels with Mao Zedong. Tignan yung picture ni Mao Zedong with Bongbong Marcos and Imelda. Andiyan yan sa Google. Type nyo lang yan, Imelda, Mao Zedong, lalabas yan. So, we normalized our ties with China, Mao Zedong China in the 70s, medyo ahead of a lot of US allies. So Ferdy Marcos was good in kind of playing this balancing game. And also with the Americans, he was driving a hard bargain. Hindi yung tipong, yes sir. Hindi yes sir. Si Marcos all the time sa mga Americans. In fact, somebody wanted to drive a harder bargain. And he was creating all of this room for maneuver for the Philippines. But where I really, really think we have to give credit is dun sa West Philippine Sea. Dun sa West Philippine Sea, kung titignan mo yung pag-asa, yung ating mga airstrip dyan, sino nag-build niyan? Saan nagsimula yan? Not 1950s, not 1990s, not 2010s, not 2020. Yes, thanks to Secretary Lorenzana, among others, mini-maintain natin yung mga facilities na yan. But actually, it was in 1970s under Marcos that we began to really assert in a concrete manner, no, yung ating claims dyan sa West Philippine Sea. Takot na nga yung ibang bansa sa atin, no, diba? So, tingnan mo yung airstrip natin dyan sa Pag-asa. It was among the first modern airstrips there in West Philippine Sea. So that's why I'm saying, like, we have to have a comprehensive discussion. And at the same time, we have to have critical thinking. Napakamahalaga yan. And we need really statesmen who have the guts and conviction, no? Who are competent, at the same time, a basic level of human dignity and decency and fear of God, right? And all those elements have to be together. We have had statesmen like that. We can name names, but how many are there? No, parang kulang eh. You really need a generation of sustained, fully committed, real educators and great leaders, for us to get out of the mess and all of the deficiencies and democratic deficits and disasters in the first generation or two after the Philippines independence, on the eve of the end of Second World War. Okay, so there, this is a very serious topic, so yan, sorry kung hindi ako nag-react masyado dun sa mga shout-out nyo and all of that, but yun nga, I felt we really have to seriously discuss it. So I felt analysis by Freud, but especially Max Weber, is very, very helpful. So please check my article tomorrow for Philippine Daily Inquirer when I discuss this in more details, and you can see quotations and everything that I'm trying to say here. But yeah, any questions? Of course, mahabang usapan to, no? I mean, we can go on forever, but at least we have had to have some basic preliminary discussions. Oh yeah. By the way, I'm just talking about just the appeal of the Marcos name and the Marcosian brand of governance. Of course, some people say, if the sins of the father are not the sins of the son, then the achievements, whether real or not, of the father are not necessarily the achievements of the son. So of course, if someone wants to be the president, they have to stand on their own feet. They have to stand on their own achievements, and let's have a discussion about that. Sure, right? Yeah. Ayan na yung mga obvious. Please, wag kayong mag-troll dyan. We're trying to have proper discussions here. Gilberto, kung ikaw man talaga yan, okay? Please, okay? Alright. Publico survey. Let's see. I still have to look at the methodology. Pinost ko naman yung summary ng methodology. But, ako lang naman, sa akin lang naman, you have to look at different surveys and then kind of find the median and trend lines. Akin, trend lines ang more importante. So trend lines is clear. Bongbong Marcos is consolidating as a lead contender, and Leni Robredo's numbers are also on the rise, right? So hindi lang 3% ang opposition, right? It could be way several times bigger than that, right? So yun. Any questions? Yeah, I mean, we can go into this. This is a very complicated issue. But these are just some of my preliminary analysis. Hopefully, one day, kung may energy tayo and time and all of that, we can really, I hope to write really a book about, the Philippines in a much more retrospective and also prospective way. Yeah. Gilberto Sapico, kanina ka pa nagpo-post ng same thing over and over dyan, ha? Okay, I'm gonna check kung totoo kang tao, okay? I mean, even if totoo kang tao, please, wag tayo mag-troll dito, okay? Yung pag ganun. People are trying to have a proper discussion, okay? Oh, yan ha. Sige na, Gilberto, mag-discuss naman tayo na mabuti. Do you have questions, Gilberto? Oh, shout out. Do you have questions? Oh, yan na naman eh. Oh, bahala ka na. I'll check it later. Yeah, yun nga eh. So, in history, if you look at it, we have had many autocratic leaders that didn't do too bad in terms of development. Now, of course, there were disasters on the human rights and democracy front, but they didn't do too bad. But at the same time, I mean, for every Deng Xiaoping or Lee Kuan Yew, name me, I can name you dozens of Gaddafi, Mugabe, and of course, people, right? Na mga Guinness level of corruption and incompetence. Yun yung problema eh. Oh, andyan na naman yung isa. Pasaway eh. Kaya, ay nako, pasaway eh. Okay. Any other questions? You know, one thing that really got my attention the other day was I saw this piece by New York Times. May podcast sila with Saif Gaddafi, the son of former Libyan dictator Gaddafi. Pakinggan niyo yung mga sinasabi niya. Absolutely no contrition, absolutely no regrets about the brutality of his father rule. And he's using his father's name, the Gaddafi name, to potentially become the next leader of Libya after everything that Gaddafi did and after all those years of post-Gaddafi chaos and all. So, you know, many interesting parallels, yeah. Yeah, Guinness level. Pakicheck yung Guinness Book of Record. May record tayo dyan. Yung isang politiko natin may Guinness level. In fairness. Hindi naman. I mean, di ba ang try naman natin dito is to reach out to, you know, as complicate. Kasi ako, I believe in people's ability to really have sustained rational discussion. But we have to make it passionate. We have to make it interesting and engaging, no? Kaya nga sinasabi ko ito hindi sa loob na isang classroom. I mean, how many people do FBI Lives and discuss Max Weber and Freud and Hobsbawm and all of that, right? Pero hindi naman tayo boring style. We try to make it as interesting and relevant to our discussion, right? Yeah. How strong is Philippine status in ASEAN? Unfortunately, we're not a big player in ASEAN anymore. We were among the founding members in the 1960s. We were a big element in the so-called Mafilindo, Makapagal time and all of that. But we're not, we're a marginal player. Singapore, Indonesia, even Malaysia and Thailand, and now Vietnam are playing much more important role than us. So unfortunately, we have kind of lost our status, no? At tingnan mo naman yung leaders natin, yung isa pinaka anti-China, yung isa pinaka pro-China. Paano naman tayo siseryosoin kung ganyan naman yung mga style natin? Some level of continuity, some level of consistency and coherence would really help. Para hindi naman tayo pagtawanan, di ba? Yeah, I'm open to constitutional reform. And under the right conditions, a little bit even more than that. Some serious amendments and all. Yeah, sure. And, you know, if we have the right conditions, why not parliamentary, right? But again, it's a complicated issue. Hindi ito magic bullet. We can have a discussion about that. But yeah, I'm open. I'm open to properly discussing reforms. Hindi yung trollish discussion of reforms. No, yung properly discussing reforms. Right. Yeah, yung term ko na developmental dictatorship, actually the term is developmental states, but a lot of these developmental states from Japan, Germany, you know, Prussia, Germany, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and others, they actually happen in the context of authoritarian leader. But we also have context whereby there was no dictatorship that oversaw economic progress. I mean, if you look at the economic miracle in Italy after the Second World War, it was under a democratic regime. The fascists were terribly incompetent under Mussolini, no? Si Mussolini medyo kamukha niya si ano. Anyways, and then Scandinavia. If you look at Sweden, a lot of Scandinavian countries. Look at Britain, right? A lot of the economic success they had. I mean, industrial revolution happened in Scotland, UK, etc. And that was the more democratic part of the world, where the parliament actually had a lot of say in governance. And increasingly, we're talking about constitutional monarchy. So may monarchy ka, but hindi absolutist monarchies, right? So interestingly, if you look at a lot of successful cases in history, right, they were actually in much more democratic context too. So hindi porkit meron kang dictatorial developmental systems in Korea and all, that's the only way. There are alternatives. And this is the problem. You might get a dictator without development. You know, so you know, there was an Indian who said that we sacrifice democracy for development by electing certain populist guy who's in power. In the end, they lost it both daw. Yung economy nila, one of the worst affected last year along with the Philippines. And then democracy din nila sobrang undermined. So, be careful. It's not a clear-cut bargain. Because sabi ko nga, most dictators actually end up bad. Right? Because walang checks and balance. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, some of the few successful cases that we have had, I would argue the causal link is not because may dictators sila per se. It's because they had strong state institutions that were able to be deployed for the empowerment of key sectors of the economy. So talagang gusto kong leader is someone, you know, who really invests in strengthening yung mga ministries natin in charge of industrial policy, trade policy, national defense, mga ganun, no? At yun ang medyo kulang sa atin sa mga discussion natin. We talk about strong leader but not strong institutions that much. We don't even know what is an institution. We don't discuss it that much. We don't talk about the importance of bureaucracy. Napakamahalaga yan. So yun yung mga frustration ko. I mean, the fact that yung Philippines is one of the longest running failed cases of land reform. That tells you a lot. I don't think the problem is just our different administrations. Ang problem din dyan is yung implementation of the law. But the implementation law is not just political will, it's also the capacity of your state institutions. The agrarian reform institutions, the Department of Agriculture, yung mga LGUs, people are in charge on the ground, the courts, which are there to supposedly protect the interests of yung mga ating mga magsasaka na inaapi ng mga kanilang mga, yung mga dating land owners, etc. So, it's a failure. And not to mention yung financial support also, and irrigation among other things, right? Yeah, another thing that happened under Marcos, a lot of irrigation projects happened. But of course, he had 20 years in power, so I mean, that's a lot of time, right? Margaret Thatcher, we can talk about her. She actually quite destroyed British state system and deindustrialized the country. Many people are blaming Margaret Thatcher for where Britain is today, but let's not go there. I mean, we can discuss about Churchill, Attlee, among other things. Panoorin niyo na lang The Crown. Canada? What's up with Canada? Well, I mean, okay, ito ring problema kayo. When people talk about federalism, etc., kino-compare nila yung Pilipinas to, I don't know, Germany or whatever. Why not compare to other developing countries, same level natin na medyo federal? Whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Brazil, yung mga ganong ka-level natin, tignan mo, effective ba yung federalism dyan? And then we can learn certain lessons here and there, right? And as far as Canada is concerned, yung problems at Quebec, the French-speaking parts, I mean, that problem has been there for quite some time. Or look at Belgium. The federalism, this kind of a Flemish-French kind of divides. I remember there was a time where national governments of Belgium, right, because of these disagreements, right? So, in parliamentary, I mean, Turkey is parliamentary, Malaysia is parliamentary today. Tignan mo naman yung levels of corruption. Tignan mo naman yung economy nila, diba? Especially in Turkey, in a downward spiral, right? So just because you're parliament, it doesn't mean everything will be fine, right? Yeah. Yes, secessionist movements and insurgencies are a reflection of weak state institutions, diba? A state, Max Weber put it this way, is a centralized authority that has legitimized monopoly on the use of force. Ang problema sa atin is yung estado natin, its legitimacy has been questioned over and over again, and its monopoly on the use of violence is also very questionable. Marami tayong mga insurgent groups, among others, all across the country na may sariling baril and all. So walang monopoly on violence yung estado natin. Our state building process has been absolutely incomplete and imbalanced. Tapos gusto mo pa i-further decentralize yan with a weak central state. I mean, if there's one thing that you can learn from places like Germany is that to have effective decentralization, you have to have a strong center to decentralize it properly. Otherwise, sabog yung process. At pag sabog yung process, well, it doesn't end up well. I mean, look at ARMM, for instance. O yung Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, right? It was a mini experiment, a kind of pilot project in federalism. But because the state institutions were not properly capacitated to decentralize to support the new kind of autonomous region there. There are also questions about trapo politics, corruption, warlordism. Hindi nag-work, right? So just because you decentralize doesn't mean everything will be automatically well, right? And sometimes, on problems with decentralization, when you decentralize, regions that are richer, right, and more successful and more powerful may be able to get even more investments and best brains and best and brightest from across the country, across the world. So actually, existing patterns of inequality can be further exacerbated, right? Again, I mean, look at the US, for instance. New York, California, the richer states, they have been richer states in the past, they're still the richer states, and the gap between them and some of the poorer regions, Kansas area, I mean, some of the Midwest area, Rust Belt area, the gap is not closing. In many ways, the gap is actually increasing. And if you're a smart kid from some of the poorer states in US, where do you want to go? You want to go and study in Yale Law School, right? And then you want to go and work in Silicon Valley, right? That's how you get rich. That's how you get successful. You don't stay back in the poorer states in America. You go to the East Coast, West Coast, or you go to Texas for that matter, which is like an oil-rich area, and also getting Tesla and all of these companies to also go there because low tax and all of that. Yeah, pagdating naman sa corruption. Corruption, again, there are various forms of corruption. So, for instance, China has very high levels of corruption, but it's also very highly economically prosperous country, at least compared to where it was 20, 30 years ago. Because dun sa China, ang nakakorrupt, karamihan dyan medyo nasa-circulate sa root ng economy. So maybe corrupt officials also become good businessmen, and then good businessmen create good factories, jobs. So it kind of circulates. Ang problema is the kind of corruption now we have had, which is kukorrupt ka, tapos yung pera ay mag-end up sa Swiss bank. hindi nagsisirculate sa loob ng economy. So there are varieties of corruption. In fact, there was a term called efficient corruption, no, in the developmental literature, but let's not go there because we don't want to. But what I'm saying is that corruption is also kind of a reflection of the weakness of state institutions. Kasi kung malakas yung estado mo, maganda yung bayad sa mga bureaucrats mo. If meron kang courts na effective, people wouldn't dare to be corrupt. Because if they become corrupt, they'll end up in jail. I mean, look at Singapore, a very interesting system. They have zero tolerance for corruption, but they also pay their bureaucrats very well. Some of their top ministers, etc., they're paid CEO level. They're also forced to get CEO training level. So you have ministers, top level officials in Singapore who are very, very skilled, very, very well paid, and if they dare to be corrupt, boom, you're going to be in trouble. Zero tolerance. So I think this is a serious issue we have to discuss. That's why Singapore's state institutions are absolutely efficient, right? It's not because they're authoritarian per se. It's because of their strong state institutions and bureaucratic tradition, and major combination of Confucianism and also the English bureaucratic legacy they got, right? Tayo kasi mga Americans at saka Spanish, ang hina yung mga state institutions nila. I mean, the US that conquered us is the late 19th century US, not the New Deal US or post-World War II US. Yung US na yung late 19th century, sabog yung US na yan. Sobrang sabog. Yun yung tayo na Gilded Age, di ba? Yung kay Mark Twain. Dami nilang mga oligarchs, may mga populist parties sila, grabe yung inequality nila. Panoorin yung Gangs of New York. Daniel Day-Lewis, yung mga yun. Tignan mo, grabe yung corruption doon. Mga gangs were in charge of different parts of New York. So, 19th century US was not a very impressive place. And it was that US that conquered us. And unfortunately, they passed down to us this kind of a anarchic, libertarian state legacy, which obviously is not working very well, yeah. By the way, all of this I have discussed in my books and works in one way or another, no? So, pwede nyo i-google lang siguro yung iba dyan, like, what I say, and you put the next word next to it, may something lalabas for sure. I've discussed them in detail. One of the things I can suggest is, I had a blog on Huffington Post back in the days. Oy, blogger din ako at this then, no? Pero sa Huffington Post. Check nyo yan. Something like, The Folly of Authoritarian Nostalgia. Panorin yan. Panorin. Basahin niyo yan. Andyan ko, na-analyze ko yan. Binigyan ko na yung mga case studies. Paki-check yan. Alright. Any last questions? Yeah, yung issue ng judicial institutions pag-usapan natin yun. Actually, I have a publication with Cambridge University Press the other year together with folks from Harvard Law School. So, in Harvard Law School, they actually invited me over to give a lecture and talk. So, pinag-usapan namin yung judicial institutions. At may publication ako dyan. There's also another one coming up, subaltern populism, also with Cambridge University Press. This is with folks in, I think, Sydney, the law schools in Sydney, etc. So that will come out. We can discuss this separately. Alright? Any last point? Helmut Schmidt. I'd rather talk about Schultz than Schmidt. But, yeah, I mean, Germany, medyo complicated case yan. Alam ko, former President Aquino was very much into German politics and interesting and all. But that's it. We're not Germany. We're more like Italy, right? So maybe we have to discuss Italian politicians who did pretty well, not the Berlusconi types, right? I think that would be more reasonable. Yeah, I mean, we can discuss agrarian reform issue. I'm not an expert on that. But the reality is that if you look at the cases of successful agrarian reform, they had also very strong state institutions that were able to provide financial support dun sa mga magsasaka, to provide really efficient dispensation of justice dun sa mga inaabuso or inaape, and also financial support. No? I mean, we discussed that earlier. Tsaka, yun nga, sinigurado na hindi yung mga oligarchs ang nagdidictate ng batas about land reform. I mean, a lot of congressmen and politicians that perhaps were overseeing the law and the land reform and all were themselves going to be affected negatively. So you can imagine what the kind of stuff that we're going on. Right, yeah. Okay, so I'll keep it there because we can go on forever. But thank you very much. Today, I just really wanted to go back to this issue ng the rise of the Marcoses and look at this as the reflection of some fundamental deficiencies dito sa ating post-EDSA regime. No, a revolution is when you have a complete transformation of society. I'm not sure we have had that. We had a revolt, we had protest, yeah, but I don't think the revolution was completed. And when you have half-completed revolutions, you have restoration of Ancien regime. This is what we're saying in many ways. No, let's see, things can change. But I think on two levels, statesmanship and education, we have had huge failures over the past 20, 30 years. And we're paying the price for that. Kaya, yun nga eh. They say, victors write the history, but you never know who are the final victors. The losers of 30, 40 years could be the victors of tomorrow too. So that's what you have to keep in mind. That's what you have to keep in mind. That's why, to make sure that you preserve the gains of a revolution, you really sustain transformational policies and bring really inspiring reforms. At yung edukasyon mo, siguraduhin mo walang ano. You know, go to Germany. Their education system absolutely doesn't whitewash yung nangyari ng Second World War. It constantly reminds the German people, you don't want to go to that past, to that ugly past of Germany. That's why Germany today, you know, it's, yes, there's alternative for Deutschland and all of this new Nazi, whatever, but they're really marginal, right? Mainstream politics in Germany is among the most progressive on earth, if not the most progressive, right? And this is a country that had very, very difficult past. And this is a country which is also an economic and industrial superpower. Amazing. I mean, what Germany has achieved over the past 50, 60 years is just amazing, considering where they were 100 years ago, First World War, Second World War, etc. Right? So yeah, in that sense, I'm willing to learn a bit or two, especially from the Germans. Right? They don't whitewash their past. They don't let really the worst people from the past to just have an easy time. Right? There was some justice, at least, for people who really did gruesome things in the past, and they have zero tolerance for historical revisionism and lies and all of these things. Right? Saan naman ang Pilipinas, no? Saan naman ang Pilipinas? Yun yung concern ko, no? So yun. Alright. Medyo sabaw na ako. Sorry, I have an academic book chapter to work on. Medyo on Taiwan yan, so medyo complicated issue yan kasi yung mga nangyari sa Taiwan Straits. So I have to go into a different mode. Medyo lapas tayo dyan. I'll go into my Taiwan analysis mode. Alright? Maraming salamat. Thank you very much for sticking with us. And then please, thank you so much also yung mga iba na hindi na nagtutroll, right? Remember, troll doesn't mean na bot ka lang. Troll means that tingnan mo yung definition ng troll sa Google, sa dictionary, right? Yung nag-ano ka, you know, alam mo na. May pag-asa bang Pilipinas? Of course. Of course may pag-asa ng Pilipinas. I mean, thank God we still have a lot of freedoms and everything like that to fight. We have so many blessings still. Always keep that in mind. You know, but I mean, just look at what happened in Afghanistan. You know, the people there are still fighting for democracy. We still have democracy. It's besieged, it's troubled, it's scarred, it's traumatized, but we still have some basic freedoms. Okay, use it very well. Use it very well. Don't take it for granted. Don't take it for granted. And life is worth it when you believe in things and you're willing to fight for them. Right? Not to be a martyr, but a life without principles is a life without purpose. Yun lang. Yun lang masasabi ko. And what we really need is a whole generation of committed statesmen and educators. Really move it up. But all of us as you know, all active citizens, all conscientious patriots have to do their part no matter how little. Because it's the agglomeration yung mga efforts yung lahat. No? Natin lahat that we can move in the right direction. Yun lang. Alright? Maraming salamat and let's keep in touch. Salamat. Thank you. Alright.